hppodcraft.com.
This is Chad Pfeiffer.
And this is Chris Lackey.
And we are at the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At hppodcraft.com. Today we're not alone, however.
No.
We're joined today by archaeologist and all-around cool guy, James Holloway.
Hello.
Now, I heard of James from a lecture that you did at Treadwell's in London, was it last year?
Yeah, that's right. One last year and one this year.
Oh, you did another one?
Well, I did the same one twice.
Oh, you did the same one twice.
What's Treadwell's? Is that a bookstore?
Yeah, Treadwell's is an alt bookshop in Covent Garden, in London, and it's this amazing tiny little place, but that's full of esoteric richness. And then they host lectures and workshops and classes pretty much 3 or 4 times a week.
Huh. So it's an occult bookstore.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So that it's in the movie where I contracted some sort of supernatural malady. If I became a werewolf or I was becoming magically thinner or something, that's the place I would go.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
To get all the exposition out of the way, so that that's where I'd get my books with the wood carvings that depict werewolves in the woods carrying babies and demons around fire and that kind of. That's where I would go to Treadwell's.
Exactly, and rows of little packets of herbs and crystals and so forth that would be used. I mean, it is exactly like. It's just like it should be.
Perfect.
Only it doesn't take itself too seriously. So really, it's good.
It can't take itself too seriously because your lecture is kind of a scientific or a literary lecture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was a little bit nervous, I think, going in that I was going to get in the audience who was going to ask, "Isn't it all real?"
I also heard another lecture from Treadwell's where it was about the Necronomicon.
That was Dan Harms.
Yes. And
it was Dan Harms. Yeah, that was late in 2008, maybe something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. In the very beginning of it, he goes, "Yeah, it's not real. It's not a real book." And I'm going to explain to you, why it got so popular and why people think that it is, which sort of ties in a little bit to your lecture.
No, absolutely. It was the success of Dan Harms' talk that prompted them to do mine.
No.
Great. Well, that's a nice transition into what we're doing today. We're covering 2, I don't know if I'd call them stories, but 2 pieces of writing by H.P. Lovecraft, who, by the way, is the author that we cover on this show. One of them is called Ibid, and the other is called The History of the Necronomicon. Now, normally we have a reader come on and go through these things because there's lots of drama and excellent writing and that sort of thing. But these 2 are kind of, well, I don't know how I would describe them, but we're just going to have James talk about it and we're going to discuss it. There's no real storyline in either of these.
Well, there is a history of the Necronomicon, which some people may or may not know, and it's kind of common knowledge now for folks that are into Lovecraft. But the original title of the Necronomicon was Al As If.
Right, that's in the first sentence of this little history that Lovecraft wrote. It's about a page long.
And supposedly it was written by Abdul Al-Hazred?
Yeah, of course. Necronomicon, when Lovecraft introduced it, is just sort of this somewhat nebulous black magic book, right? And that's in The Hound, which is written in 22 and published in 24. And as Dan Harms points out, throughout its kind of publication history, the Necronomicon seems to change its character, right? I mean, it's sort of a spell book at one point, and at another time it's a collection of mythology. But Lovecraft was, even when he was just making stuff up on the fly, he was very punctilious about details. And I think partly in order to keep himself straight, and partly because people asked him about it, he wrote this thing, The History of the Necronomicon. Yeah. And he came up with this history, so it's written circa 700 AD by Abdul Al-Hazred. He dies in 738. He is said to have been seized by an invisible monster in broad daylight and devoured horribly before a large number of witnesses. He ties it into Irem, of course, which is this legendary lost city in Arabia. He says he worshipped Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu, and says dryly he was only an indifferent Muslim. And then it's translated into Greek in 950. It's suppressed and burnt by the church authorities. It's translated into Latin in 1228 by Olaus Formius. And then there's an unprinted English translation made by John Dee and a couple of different Latin texts. And then the rest of it is just sort of about where copies of these texts now exist. So obviously there's one at Harvard, there's one in the Library of Miskatonic University, and then one in the University of Buenos Aires, which is kind of
it's sort of strange.
Yeah, it's an odd choice. I don't know why. And then there's a few other sort of offhand references. And then it was from rumors of this book, of which relatively few of the general public know, that R.W. Chambers is said to have derived the idea of his early novel, The King in Yellow, which is, of course, about this play that has all sorts of weird occult things and drives people mad and so on. I mean, which is a bit of cheek, since obviously the King in Yellow it appears to be an inspiration for the Necronomicon.
Right, exactly. It's the other way around. I mean, the King in Yellow was written in the 1890s.
Yeah, there's an interesting when Lovecraft discovers the King, he writes. I forget who he writes to, but he writes his letter saying, did you know that Robert Chambers wrote these crazy weird stories? Because Chambers was known as this writer of romance novels.
Yeah, he wrote like dime store shop girl novels.
Yeah, tons of them. Lovecraft is just shocked that the King in Yellow even exists. I mean, it's an interesting text history of the Necronomicon. It's got some errors in it. Olaus Vermius did not live in the 13th century, for instance.
Oh, no?
Nah, he was 1588 to 1655.
Oh.
It's believed that Lovecraft misread some reference in something else. But he was an antiquarian and natural philosopher. He collected strange animals and fossils, so on. There was a book, the Museum Vermianum, depicting his Cabinet of Curiosities. It was actually published after he died in 1655. And he translated this alleged thing, the Runamo inscription, which is actually a natural rock formation and stuff. And he was, your basic 17th century antiquarian scientist guy.
And Lovecraft mentions him a couple times in some of his earlier works. He's already brought up Olaus.
Yeah, no, I mean he was well known.
Now who is Dr. D?
Dr. John D is an Elizabethan sort of mystic. He's quite a character in his own right. The John D connection to the Necronomicon actually originates with Frank Belknap Long, who introduced the idea that John Dee translated the Necronomicon. He wrote up a quotation from it that was going to go in, I think, the Space Eaters. And then the quotation, I think, in the end didn't make it into the story, but Lovecraft kept the idea.
Oh.
He was an alchemist, hermeticist, mathematician, astrologer, one of the very sort of typical 16th century, atypical really in Dee's case, but you know what I mean, that boundary between science and magic. He was an expert in navigation, of course, during the time. Exploration in the Americas was very important, and he allegedly is the first person to have used the phrase British Empire.
Like he was connected to Queen Elizabeth I, wasn't
he? Absolutely. He was the astronomer royal or something like that. He was at Cambridge, in fact. He got charged with casting horoscopes at one point. He wrote occult texts. He devoted himself to studying predicting the future or divination with the aid of angels. He's the guy, if you're familiar with the Enochian alphabet, that was him. You're very colorful Renaissance scientist / occultist.
Huh. It also says that one Greek text of the Necronomicon was held by the Pickman family, which is obviously a reference to Pickman from Lovecraft's other story, Pickman's Model. And it also says it forms part of the collection of a celebrated American millionaire. Now, I'm assuming that's the Great Gatsby. But who else could that possibly be?
I don't know. I was thinking about that today. I was saying, is this a reference to a particular person? And nothing sort of leapt out at me. The text is what History of the Necronomicon is written in, I think, 1927.
Yeah.
Who that could be?
What about Hearst? Was Hearst?
That was who occurred to me. Was
what I popped into my head. Was Hearst?
Do you have a copy of the Necronomicon? If so, God help us all. But
how else do you think he was so successful?
You're really a publishing tycoon when you actually own the Necronomicon in addition to all these newspapers.
The Necronomicon does not seem to make anybody else successful.
No.
No.
Tend to come to a bad end.
Maybe Sam Raimi.
Yeah. Just like Olaus Vermius and of course John Dee. I mean, a lot of the sort of this is a very common Lovecraft. The other guy that he cites, Ibn Khaldun, if that's how you pronounce it, was another real person. He was from Iraq. He was a 13th century biographer, and he was a judge in Syria in the mid to late 12th century. He wrote this enormous biographical dictionary called "The Deaths of Eminent Men and History of the Sons of the Epoch."
Whoa.
Yeah, the English translation is 2,700 pages long.
Whoa.
Yeah, so again, it's in 4 massive volumes. So it's the kind of thing that Lovecraft could count on the more learned of his readers, and I don't know how many of those there were in the occult world, maybe having heard of, but no one ever had read.
Right, it's like Ulysses. It's on everybody's list, but nobody's read it.
Exactly. Everybody one of these days is gonna slog through all 4 volumes of a 13th century Syrian biographical dictionary. It's rich. It's on their list.
So that's sort of why, I mean, and I'm stealing directly from your lecture. That's sort of why this is kind of endured, because Lovecraft would cite these real things that people knew of but didn't necessarily know a lot about.
Yeah.
And it would sort of give him weight to whatever it is that he wrote.
And he's a master of it. I mean, the thing that I quote in my lecture is from The Nameless City, which is the first mention of Abdul al-Hazred in his fiction, although not of the Necronomicon's not in it, right. Just Abdul al-Hazred. Mm-hmm. And he says sentences from al-Hazred the Mad Arab, paragraphs from the apocryphal nightmares of Damascus, and infamous lines from the delirious Image du Monde of Gautier de Metz. Now, Damascus, real author.
Yeah.
Gautier de Metz, real author. Image du Monde, real book. And so he just throws in this reference to Abdul al-Hazred in there. And, I mean, Lovecraft perfected this pose of impenetrable erudition. And you can see it in his letters as much as his fiction. Yeah. You know, I mean, we're
going to be getting into that in just a second.
Sometimes a little wearing reading him patronizing for long at length or whatever. But yeah, he was a master of knowing how to phrase things in a way that sounded like this was merely the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah,
right.
You know what I mean? Like he was this, like clearly, well, we've all read the Image du Monde. I mean, I don't know if he had or not, but a lot of these books he'd never even seen a copy. He had the tone and the jargon of the antiquarian down so perfectly that you just, I mean, he knows a lot about weird old books that you don't know about, and this could just be one more.
And as a result of that, the Necronomicon has become almost Lovecraft, his Bigfoot or something like that, because you know his other creations didn't necessarily, they're definitely, the public is aware of them tangentially, like Cthulhu, but the Necronomicon, I mean, some people have heard about it without ever knowing anything about H.P. Lovecraft. It worked its way into people actually thinking it's a real book, you know, or it's become part of this sort of dark magic, the collection of things that you might want to get if you're into that stuff, the witchcraft or anything.
Exactly, and more than any, it's because it's not necessarily specific to the mythos. You know, it lends itself well as a prop to any broadly occult setting. So it turns up in all kinds of things. You know, obviously, I mean, you mentioned Sam Raimi earlier, where it's the book in Evil Dead is called the Necronomicon. Not particularly because anyone cared about the Cthulhu mythos. I mean, it's got nothing to do with Lovecraft, but it just sounds like a great evil tome.
Yeah.
It's got a wonderful name, the Necronomicon. This has the same effect that Lovecraft and the Lovecraft Circle created, which is that you keep constantly seeing references to the Necronomicon from a large number of unconnected creators.
Yeah. And
so therefore you assume that they're all referring to a real thing that does exist. Mm-hmm. Silly as it may sound, I think Dungeons and Dragons had a huge effect on it. The Deities and Demigods book, in which the Cthulhu mythos is right alongside actual pantheons from actual mythology.
Right. Yeah, it's in there with the Norse gods. It's in there with the Egyptian gods. Yeah,
exactly. So just like Greek gods, Cthulhu mythos. They're treated as if they were the same type of thing. And Lovecraft kept up that. I mean, that was his tactic, was that he would talk about it initially as if it was mythology.
There's a quote of his where he says that to make good science fiction, you have to write it as if you're writing a hoax.
Yeah, that's right. He wrote that to Clark Ashton Smith on October 17th, 1930. I've said, no weird story can truly produce terror unless it is devised with all the care and verisimilitude of an actual hoax.
There you go. That's it. Yeah.
And of course, we've recounted on an earlier show how Chris and I went to find the Necronomicon at the Special Collections Library at University of Illinois, only to discover the old 70s edition of L. Sprague du Camp's.
Hey,
Necronomicon. Right.
First with all that fake Arabic-looking calligraphy.
Exactly.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
It was in the special books collection. We had to go into a room and somebody brought it to us because it's a rare book.
Yeah, despite the fact that it's, as you say, from the 70s.
Yeah, I came out with that sort of orange cover, and it felt like a textbook from when I was a little kid. It was kind of disappointing. I expected
really
it to be found in human skin and start talking to me.
Well, that's someone sent that, right? If the Necronomicon existed, it would be out in paperback with a preface by Lynn Carter. And of course, it is. Because these things are never as blasphemous and horrifying as they should be, right? I mean, It's actually something, Lovecraft knew that. He actually says when you read alleged books of black magic, they're kind of boring.
Of course.
Yeah. It's much better to have something that you can make up and you can put whatever in it you want and just leave. And he leaves the rest of the imagination. Niels talks about the horrors of these books, and reading them makes people strange and drives them mad. But it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail about what's in them, because then it would just be kind of prosaic.
And that's what happens in The King in Yellow as well. There's this play that's quoted from. You see a little excerpt of some of the scenes in it, but you have no idea what really goes on in the play itself, other than that it drives aesthetes and artists completely mad.
And there have been several attempts to produce texts of The King in Yellow, and there was Tom Ring did one. And it is very eerie and atmospheric, but it's not. I mean, you put a lot of weight on that text when you say there's this thing that ruins people's lives.
Yeah, but it's still not gonna drive anybody insane.
No, I mean, and it's one of those show the monster things. It's never as frightening as what your imagination produces.
Of course. Yeah, and I mean that's why Lovecraft kicks ass, is because he's able to not tell you too much and just hint at these things, and your imagination is able to fill in all of this stuff.
Yeah, but he was very good at the passing reference. He had these ways of saying the Necronomicon, as if to say, "Oh, you know the Necronomicon." I think that's why his sort of fictitious mythology has endured when others haven't.
I hate to do this, but we should transition over to the other story, which is Ibid. It's very short as well, and it's basically a history of the writer, Ibid. When you're writing a paper and you're citing sources, Ibid that's the notation you put down to say that I'm citing the same source I just cited again, correct? I mean,
exactly,
that's what it
Ibidem, the same. Yeah, it's just a joke, basically.
Right.
And it's one that's been done many times, because I mean the joke is that it says it's from a student theme. It says the student as Ibid says in his Life of the Poet. So there's some hypothetical student who, having just flicked through a book, not really understanding it, sees this reference to Ibid and thinks, "Aha, this guy is citing something that Ibid wrote."
Right.
And there's a novel, Ibid: A Life by Mark Dunn, which is apparently made up entirely of endnotes. And there's someone else, Ralph Wiley maybe, tells a story about how as a kid he walked into the library and said, "Just give me everything you got" by Ibid. So I mean the idea is that basically he's just riffing on this idea that there's this guy Ibid who is this author of significance, and then he just starts going. I mean, he begins with these other jokes, like then CF is responsible for this work, and Ibid's masterpiece was the famous opposite.
Right.
And then he starts to go on, and I mean the rest of it, and then it starts to be full of like these little puns. Von Schreinkopf and Since His Time Littlewit and Bête Noire have shown that this strikingly said blah blah blah. So Von Schreinkopf obviously it means pig head. Bête Noire means black beast.
And they give Ibid's real name, and it's insanely long.
Right. Well, there's 3 different versions as well.
Right.
So at the very end, it's Caius Anicius Magnus Furius Camillus Aemilianus Cornelius Valerius Pompeius Julius Ibidus. And you can almost see throughout the whole thing that he's sort of making fun of himself. Like at one point, someone finds Ibid's skull, which has an inscription on it.
Right.
And it says, "He, having recognized its value from the half-effaced inscription carved in Lombardic minuscules (parentheses, paleography, it might be explained, was one of the leading accomplishments of New Netherland fur traders in the 17th century." And this is sort of one of those things, like, if you read At the Mountains of Madness, where all the sort of geologists all have intensely detailed knowledge of, forbidden occult texts, but whoever, people always just happen to have the knowledge they need.
Yes.
For that point
Exactly.
in the storyline. So this is just his strange fantasy on Ibid, and it just gets stranger and stranger.
Right. I mean, there is a story, really. It's the story of a relic, right? So it's Ibid's skull gets passed on from person to person. Yeah, and some folks realize that it is important and it's significant, and others don't know at all, and they drink beer out of it and keep their candy in it. And
yeah, but then in the end, it winds up falling into a prairie dog warren and being worshipped with dark rites by the prairie dogs. Now, I have to admit that I have not looked up too much of these historical references in Ibid.
You've done far more than I have. I have to tell you, when I first read this, it made no sense to me at all. I had to start almost every other word, start looking up and trying to figure out what it meant, and go, "Oh, okay, oh, all right, oh, okay." And then any joy that I would have got out of reading this, I didn't have at the time when I first read it. Now, after talking with you, I'm getting much more out of this story, realizing all these references. Well, this actually came from a letter that he wrote to Maurice Moe.
Right.
And it was just kind of, him riffing on stuff that he knew Maurice would get all these jokes. And
Yeah,
and I even
exactly.
think he mentions, or he names one of the characters Maurice in this story.
Yes, he does. Yes, the Emperor Maurice, who was a real person.
Oh, there was an Emperor Maurice.
Yeah, I'm sure that most of these various Ostrogoths and whatnot, all these various emperors are all real. And then I think once we get into Read 'em and Weep Hopkins, I'm willing to accept that he's probably not a real person.
Yeah, well, I love that that's, when the Americans show up, they have names like Read 'em and Weep Hopkins and Rest in Jehovah's Stubbs.
He did. He kind of went back to that well a few times, kind of poking fun at the Puritan, all these people with these strange biblical names. I mean,
Right.
Rest in Jehovah Stubbs' son is called Zerubbabel.
Right.
And then he loses it in a gambling to Epinetus Dexter, a visiting freeman of Providence.
Yeah, these are two interesting things to look at, because the Necronomicon history is clearly just sort of setting down. Finally, I've mentioned this thing a lot, but here's actually, for myself and anybody else who wants to use it, here are the notes. And then it shows, he was such a literary man and such a studier, when he wanted to have fun and cut loose, this is sort of how he did it. I'm going to write a history of Ibid.
Yeah, absolutely. And his sense of humor is sort of one of the most surprising things about him, because, of course, apart from a few comical rustics, particularly in the early stories, his fiction is just so relentlessly bleak and oppressive, and our image of him as a writer is of this sort of perpetually depressed, tormented person, and then but actually a lot of the stuff that comes out of his letters shows someone with a very rich sense of humor.
This was first published in Uwash Tanong.
I came on that reference. I got to assume a lot of Lovecraft stuff is from these. I don't even know what you would call them. I mean, I guess today they would say they were fanzines?
Like fanzines. Yeah, these kind of seem like fanzines. But it was republished again in Fantagraph in June of 1940, and then in an Uncollected Prose and Poetry 2 in 1980, and then, of course, Joshi finally put it in Lovecraft compilation in 95 called Miscellaneous Writings. I liked this type of story just because it does show a different side of Lovecraft, and it's good. Even, like you said, he didn't do this type of thing very often, but when he does, it's nice to point it out and show the other side of him. I mean, in his letters, you get a better sense of his humor, but in his writing or his prose, you just don't get that at all. It's nice to point out that he does have a pretty good sense of humor.
It's funny because, like, I often, you see a lot of the sort of modern culture and sort of merchandise associated with the Cthulhu mythos is this sort of slightly irreverent humorous, the Cully Cthulhu and the Shoggoth
Plush
from the
Cthulhu.
Roof, and exactly,
Yeah, exactly.
and all that kind of thing. Cthulhu has become. Someone said to me on the night that I gave my talk, Cthulhu is about as scary as Dracula. He's not scary at all. He's a friendly, reassuring figure in the modern day.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see that in his letters, Lovecraft, he talks about it in exactly those terms, right? He talks about these sort of mythos monstrosities that live in his house and get up to humorous hijinks. Things like that. He says, Nug and Yeb are acting up again. It's funny to see that behind the scenes, that is kind of his attitude already.
You can't take this stuff too seriously. I mean, it is horror literature, and it is scary if you think about it, but there's a point where things can't be scary anymore, where you just kind of look, okay, if the universe is meaningless and it doesn't care about you, and when you die you're just going to rot in the ground, that's kind of a sad thought, especially when most people have religious beliefs and they think that they're going to go on and that there's some caring god or gods out there that are going to, take care of you. But there's a point where you kind of just get over that idea that that's sad, and you just kind of go, well, whatever, and kind of throw up your hands and make light of it.
Well, that's kind of something that I said in the talk at Treadwell's, right? We're talking about how Lovecraftian horror is the kind of thing that theoretically postmodernism should make you immune to, right? This generation, the world is the universe is infinite, and nothing you do has any importance in cosmic terms. Well, yeah, no kidding.
Yeah,
I was aware of that. I think we all were. And so that's kind of why Lovecraft uses history and archaeology as such important motifs in his fiction, because for him, they're very intimately connected with the idea of identity. That you are your past, and therefore he has to take this cosmic nihilism, nothing matters, everything's terrible, blah, blah, and translate it into something that has relevance to the individual, so that there's more horror than just kind of this general philosophical, oh, the universe is not like we thought it was.
Mhm.
There's always this thing of the past somehow being poisoned, which means if your past is not what you thought it was, then you are not who you thought you were.
Exactly, yeah.
And this cosmic scale thing gets focused in to a much more individual level, and that's where he applies the same knowledge of history and ability to write in that antiquarian voice that he uses in things like History of the Necronomicon and Ibid, where he's using it there to either just sort of factual or comedic effect,
Mhm.
that he then uses it to create a horrific effect.
It is true. Obviously, lots of Lovecraft's writing looks at the past, and the past is not what you thought it was, which means you're not who you think you are. Be it if you have a relative that became a cannibal, or your great-great-great-grandfather a gorilla.
Right.
Yeah. Which admittedly is not an analogy that holds up terribly well, I think, for the modern reader.
No.
These two pieces of work, the History of the Necronomicon and Ibid, on their own are maybe not that compelling of pieces of fiction, but they're worth looking at for people who are interested in Lovecraft's unique talent and why he resonates so well with modern audiences still, and with so many other writers. And it's because of this ability to incorporate history and fiction together.
It's all a question of his sort of mastery of that discourse. Which is interesting when you consider sort of his educational background, right? Lovecraft didn't go to university, he didn't even finish high school.
No.
But he was sort of self-educated, a voracious reader. And he seems to have, if you look at the stuff he wrote as a little kid, he has this sort of gift for mimicry, I guess. He writes very effectively in the voices of certain types of people. And sort of antiquarians and scholars and historians definitely among them. Which really, I think, contributes to the whole sort of is it real aspect of the mythos. I don't think anyone has ever gone around wondering whether Conan the Barbarian existed.
Right.
And right?
Maybe Schwarzenegger. I need some photos of this guy. How am I going to play him? I don't even know what he talks like.
Even though Howard is writing in something that's more or less recognizable with the real world at a very high level of approximation, it hasn't had that lasting impact.
Oh yeah, Conan as a character is fun to read about, and he's exciting and engaging, but at no point would I ever think that Conan's world was a real place. It seems completely fictional and fantastic. And Lovecraft is much more subdued with his settings. Even his town, when I first started getting into Lovecraft, I just assumed Arkham was a real place. Yeah. It wasn't until I was, older and started doing research that I realized, it's a fictionalized town.
And he uses a lot of sort of real world analogies, partly in the towns and things. Also, like if you look at the Mountains of Madness, for instance, the details of the Antarctic expedition are all based on contemporary Antarctic exploration. The same is true in the archaeology. Like he's always talking about what at that time was sort of relatively recent discovery. So he talks about Machu Picchu, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Machu Picchu was 1913, I think. Hiram Bingham discovered. I say discovered. He was the first American to know where it was, and isn't that really what's important?
Right. right.
The locals knew where it was.
Yeah, they know it was there for a long time, but the American found out, so now it's discovered.
Yeah, or he says something. I think he says, he says the primal foundation walls of Kish, as dug up by the Oxford Field Museum expedition in 1929. So he's, in that case, he's going with something that would be, that was breaking news. That was a relatively modern sort of scientific topic. Right. That's something that I think that's in At the Mountains of Madness, which is from 1930.
When am I going to meet this Conan? Where does he live? You haven't even set up the interview yet. How am I going to do this movie?
That's actually weird.
I don't know. Why am I still on that? Well, James, this has been really informative. You're a great guest to have on. You have so much knowledge about this, and it's a great take on these stories. And really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, it's absolutely, man. It's been really great having you.
Now, the lecture that James gave at Treadwell's was called The Layers of Cthulhu. We'll put a link up to it on our page. So after you get done with this, you can click over there and have a listen to that. It's about an hour long, and lots of good information there as well. Next week, we will be covering The Curse of Yig. The heck is that about?
Yig. Well, Yig, I believe, is some kind of serpent god.
I believe there's a curse as well.
Awesome. I like serpents and I love curses. So that's probably going to be a really good one.
All right. Again, thank you, James. And with that, I am Chris Lackey.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
Oh, and I'm James Holloway.
And this has been the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At hppodcraft.com.
hppodcraft.com.